Hello everyone, welcome to this event and thank you so much for being here. My name is Nguyen and I'm currently a doctoral researcher in social linguistics and education at the Open University UK. And in this presentation today, I want to share with you my ongoing PhD research, and it's entitled Internationalization of Vietnamese Higher Education Through English Medium Instruction Programs, a literature review on outcomes. Okay, so the structure of today's presentation includes 5 main parts. First, I want to talk about the background and overview of EMI research. The second part, I want to share more about the state of art scholarship in terms of Vietnamese higher education context. In the next part, I want to talk about the systematic review methods that I used to come up with this research. And the next part, I will present my findings on the EMI outcome research. And finally, I will summarize all of the key points I mentioned in this presentation today. Okay, so the first part of the presentation is to do with the background and an overview of English medium instruction research. I think I can start a bit personal here. Is that I think a decade ago, like 10 years ago, I decided to study abroad in the UK. Because I always wanted to sort of learn disciplinary knowledge and also improve my English language skills. That's why I just look for opportunities to really get a chance to come to the UK to study. But fast forward 10 years later, now I've witnessed from a distance, of course, a dramatic change, expansion in terms of English teaching and learning English as a foreign language in Vietnam, especially in my hometown in Kon Tum. There has been also like a shift from just teaching and learning English as a foreign language to now teaching academic content in English as a medium of instruction. So that sort of like struck me personally. But when I actually looked into the scholarship in terms of language learning and also English medium instruction research, then this sort of trend of development coincides with the internationalization of higher education, in which universities worldwide are looking for ways to internationalize their curriculum. They also want to attract more international staff and faculty to get on the global rankings for the financial and the reputational incentives that come with it. So in this sort of like dynamic changing context of globalization, then the role of English has now evolved to include not only the elements of language learning, but also content learning as well. So here I included one of the most cited definition on English medium instruction, which is the use of English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdiction where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. So you can see from figure 1, there are a lot of types of language and content provision, and you can see there's the content driven or dominant objectives, and on the one hand we have the content dominant objectives, and on the other hand we have language dominant objectives, and you can see the language driven sort of spectrum. We have English as a foreign language learning and teaching, which is more like traditional second language or acquisition discipline. But on the other end, to my sort of right, left-hand side, you have EMI has emerged as a newly developed scholarship that also, encompassed elements of of language learning, but also content delivery as well. So, which is really an exciting area, at least to me, to look at. So we have like a bit of a geographical map of EMI development worldwide. So the initiative of EMI actually started first in Europe through the Bologna process in 1999. During this process, so several, like I think 28 EU countries, state members comes together and sort of decided to agree on this standardization of higher education qualification in Europe, and they advocated the role for multilingualism, and also sort of like advocate the introduction of English medium instruction, English taught courses within sort of European universities for a wider range of students, and increase more mobility within the higher education sector in the EU area as well. So it started first in Europe, but it's very quickly expanded to other areas as well. So in Middle East, there has been evidence that EMI has been received and implemented in Saudi Arabia, in countries like Europe, Arab Emirates, for the also the economic and the financial sort of demands for the area to have international education and English speaking labor force. So not just in Middle East, but also in East Asia, there has been lots of initiatives. In South Korea, you have the Globalization Project, or the Global 30 Project in Japan, and EMI is also gaining momentum in China as well, talking about transnational education and just the increasingly recognized role and important status of English in those countries. Unfortunately, the areas of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam and other continents like Africa and Latin America, remain under research areas of EMI, and there has been calls for more research in those underrepresented areas of EMI. So this is why there's this research, and this research of mine also aims to fill this gap. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the Vietnamese higher education context. So a bit of an overview of Vietnamese higher education sector. I really like the quote from Lê Hà and Ngọc, it's standing between flows. So after the end of the Vietnam War, Vietnam went through a brief period of economic sanctions and political isolation from the rest of the world. But the đổi mới, or the reform policy that happened during the 1980s, towards the end of 1980s, really commenced and sort of triggered a dramatic change in terms of social economic policy, directions towards which the Vietnamese higher education sector was heading towards. So the new mission of the Vietnamese higher education sector was is to strengthen the country's human resources to serve the cause of industrialization and modernization within the context of Vietnamese socialist oriented market economy and international integration. So this is from resolution number 29 in 2013. So basically, lots of scholars in the field of higher education like Leha and Ngọc spotted the very tricky position that the Vietnamese higher education sector is now located within. So on the one hand, or to start with, there are elements of neoliberalism in the sense that now universities are getting more autonomous and there's been transfer of institutional and budgetary powers from the central government to universities themselves. On the other hand, they remain very much strong grip of socialism and socialist principles, in the sense that the đổi mới policy is still serving as the guiding principle that modernized the economy with retaining with the Vietnamese characteristics. So there are compulsory Marxist-Leninist learning and philosophy, like philosophy classes to be taught at Vietnamese universities. On the ground, interestingly, there's also evidence of Confucianism. So long time back in history, Vietnam was part of China's sort of tributary system, the Thiên Sa system, where Confucian values that propose that the role education should forms like a noble pursuit for each individual in the society, and the practice of elitist education and also private education are very much encouraged in ancient Confucian society, but somehow it's still like running through and sort of retain within individual beliefs within the Vietnamese society. So there are different ideological flows which makes the higher education context in Vietnam really dynamic and contested. Sort of located in this dynamic scene, then the implementation, the arrival of English medium instruction comes with different incentives and rationale. So at macro and policy level, policymakers really see EMI as a quick fix strategy to improve students' proficiency to help with the course of modernizing the country. And also universities at meso and institutional level sort of reckon this EMI provision as opportunities to attract and recruit international staff and students. Not much success in doing that, but there are opportunities, and some cited scholars have talked about that, have looked into it, and also a source of profitability and reputational boost, consistent with other with the trends elsewhere. In terms of internationalization of higher education. And at macro and classroom level, students have sort of come to learn that EMI can help them to improve their English skills and employability, and also sort of provide them with access to English written resources, hence more standardized and more globalized sort of academic content. So more international opportunities and further education opportunities as well. So this is the local context. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk about the sort of the systematic review method or procedure that I use in this research. So I adopted guidelines on systematic review from Gov. And these include inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. First of all, in terms of inclusion criteria, there's first round of selection where I search keywords on online databases, including some English written, Vietnamese written, and Chinese written databases. And the initial result yielded 781 results. And these include peer-reviewed articles, doctoral theses, and as I just mentioned, resources in 3 languages are considered to sort of reduce the selection bias of just only reviewing English written resources. The second round of selection, I applied more filters. So I screen abstract and basing on a new sort of set of filters and to help me narrow down the results. So I only selected the studies that reported empirical data on instructional outcomes of EMI and included studies that frame or define EMI as content and language-driven programs, and the studies that are conducted in contexts in which English is not the majority of the first language speakers. Basically, a final total of 41 empirical studies were yielded. So there has been like a dramatic shift reduction of result due to several filters that apply for the second round of selection. In terms of exclusion criteria, I sort of excluded studies that frame EMI as purely language learning program, and also studies that are more focused on theoretical analysis and systematic reviews are also excluded. Other types of unmentioned publications like blogs, commentary, book reviews, or master dissertations are not considered either. So studies that were documented on an Excel sheet with key information recorded in columns for content analysis. So now I'm moving on to the findings. So as you can see from the pie chart, my findings show that EMI research are mostly focusing the East Asia and Europe geographies, leaving Middle East and other regions sort of like a less represented areas, and that confirms with early previous findings or current findings in the literature that South Asia or Africa or Latin America is being sort of underexplored areas of EMI research. In terms of like EMI subjects classification, according to Macro in 2018, there are 2 like sort of broad categories of EMI subjects that can be listed here. So hard subjects include subjects like science, medical studies, engineering, or physics, and soft subjects include subjects like economics, business administration, accounting and finance, history, and philosophy. So the sort of like the range of EMI subjects considered in this research are quite large. Okay, so in terms of research methods that have been used in EMI outcome studies. A total of 41 studies reviewed. 14 of them used qualitative methods like interviews, focus group, or perception questionnaire, being the dominant sort of research method. And test scores or quantitative questionnaire has 10, and the other 10 used mixed method design. Experimental research has 5, and multi-method, including document analysis, classroom observation, and interviews, has only 2 studies. Okay, so a bit of a more detailed breakdown of total studies in terms of their outcome focus. So as I mentioned, EMI outcomes have been framed as language development. 16 of them focus on this particular linguistic outcome of EMI, whereas 11 other studies focus on the content learning or disciplinary knowledge outcomes of EMI. 10 studies actually look at both types of outcomes, and surprisingly, there are other 4 studies that define EMI or focus on EMI outcomes at something quite beyond language and content. So in terms of findings, so I sort of classified the finding type into positive gains, negative loss, and mixed findings. So you can see from here, the majority of studies reported mixed findings. So there are some positive gains, but negative loss are incurred during the EMI sort of participation of students as well. So now let's move on to the sort of component outcomes. So here, the EMI impacts on language gains. So as I mentioned, the main methods that are employed to determine the linguistic gains of EMI, including using general English test scores, like examples include National High Stakes English Test, end of term scores, GPA on English as foreign language subjects, component English skills performance, like scores in reading, writing, listening skill, speaking, grammar, or pragmatic complexity are all considered. There are also some use of self-reported perception questionnaires as well. I've looked at perceived language gains from EMI learning, language learning motivation, English self-efficacy beliefs. The finding, as I mentioned, are mostly mixed findings, with some studies reporting that improvement focused on receptive linguistic skills like listening and reading, and not so much on productive speaking or writing. There are insignificant gains in writing and aspects of language knowledge like vocabulary and grammar. And the only positive gains, or like the only area of positive improvement is in students' perception of their self-efficacy beliefs, the motivation, and less language anxiety. There are several limitations on this sort of aspects of EMI language outcomes. So various indicators of language gains and inconsistencies in research methods lead to difficulties to identify any obvious patterns and determine the effects of EMI on linguistic skills. So what I'm recommending here is a more holistic and comprehensive framework on defining EMI language gains. Research methods that enable valid, reliable, and fair assessment of EMI language outcomes is required. And also there should be more consideration in terms of contextual, learners' individual and social cultural factors. Okay, so the next part is EMI impact on content learning. So content learning from the result is usually measured through GMI scores, student learning reports, experimental test scores, and also self-reported perceptions. The findings show conflicting evidence on whether EMI has adversely affected learning, with slightly more studies confirming a loss of content comprehension. So there are remaining issues with the EMI studies on content learning as well. So there's the lack of evidence to track changes in learning over time, like longitudinal studies would have helped. There's also a lack of comparison between control and here what I meant is the comparison between students' learning outcomes within the EMI sort of program and the first language or non-EMI medium instruction program. So you have like two distinct comparison groups. Here, most of the studies are just focusing on just EMI groups. So we don't really know about the effects without any EMI participation. Also, studies have overtly focused on using GPA as an indicator of academic success. I do believe that this is quite an inadequate measure of learning, even though I see why and the convenience of using like a composite index of learning like that. But the sort of the indicator of academic success could have done more holistically. Okay, so in terms of EMI impacts on language content learning, so both outcomes, mostly they are mixed findings with language impacts more clearly defined and measured than content impacts. Studies mostly adopted a mixed method design to measure outcomes in both learning and content. There are some remaining issues again here. There are inconsistencies in methodological techniques. Most of them are qualitative perception-based research, which make it very difficult to compare and contrast between different contexts and different outcomes. And also there's a lack of clear theoretical framework to explain and sort of interpret the implications of language content learning outcomes. Okay, so in terms of outcomes that are beyond language content learning, studies have looked at learner self-concept and identified formation outcomes. So EMI has emerged as a product of internationalization that led to homogenization of cultural values in China. There are some studies on that. And also there has led to a new creation of or division of different classes, the privilege afforded classes in EMI with ambivalence about local and global nexus of values and beliefs, and learners' self-concept and internality compared to the first language medium instruction learners as well. The knowledge production outcomes. EMI conceals a hidden hegemonic hierarchy and promoted uneven development of knowledge production. So Song has indicated that EMI curriculum has sort of promoted or exacerbated the distinction between native versus non-native speakerism, and sort of advocated mechanized academic norms and discipline-specific knowledge limited to only the global north. In terms of social justice outcomes, Hammett highlighted the effects of EMI policies on social class divisions, English and local medium instruction students forming self and othering representation, and sort of have consequences on social cohesion and social inequality. Again, I've sort of highlighting the remaining issue here is a lack of clear theoretical framework to explain relationships between language content learning and other outcomes. To summarize my presentation today, there's a strong link between internationalization of higher education and English medium instruction provision. The development of EMIs to code macro is an unstoppable train, but somehow the terminology and underlying assumptions of EMI remain subject to contextualization and readaptation to local circumstances. Knowledge gap include EMI research in language content learning and other forms of outcomes at higher education level. And I'm calling for a more comprehensive framework, both methodologically and theoretically, to evaluate the effectiveness of EMI programs on student learning outcome. Okay, so I think that's everything from me for now. This is the selected references. And thank you very much for your attention. Any further questions and comments, you can email me at the address here. Thank you very much.